Alright, so I figured it was about time for another animated Disney versus, and I knew I wanted to do 101 Dalmatians, I just wasn't sure how, and then it just kind of evolved into why not just do a dogs versus cats kind of thing. And yeah, because I also liked the Aristocats when I was growing up, but I didn't watch it near as often as I watched 101 Dalmatians. And the reason I wanted to start with 101 Dalmatians when I was trying to think of what to do with this, it's basically it was the one that was my favorite when I was growing up. Basically before The Lion King came along, this was the one that I kind of watched over and over again. My family especially likes to bring up, still to this day in my 30s, that I basically watched 101 Dalmatians on a loop. Once again, at least before the VHS for The Lion King came out, and then that kind of took over as my favorite Disney movie, and almost 30 years later still hasn't been dethroned. But yeah, at the very start of my life, it was just 101 Dalmatians all the time, and it actually hasn't fallen that far from that as far as when I look at, what my favorite Disney movies of the past are. Because I still love this movie when I come back to it, and I will still watch it relatively frequently. It's quite short, so it's kind of easy to do that with. But at least once a year, I'll come back to it, and I still love it just the same. So, but like I said, I didn't watch the Aristocats as many times. I was mainly usually when I went back to the Aristocats, it was mainly for like Napoleon and Lafayette, and that was about it. I always thought Edgar was kind of a funny villain, also, but I wasn't maybe attached to it near as much, to say the least, as this one, because I wasn't really attached to much of any of the others, the way I was with this one. So, going into it, they do both have these nice nostalgic opening credits when you come back to them that you might kind of miss if you're watching the newer movies, or you've been watching the newer movies, where it's like, it's nice to see how creative they were, and how, like, even in the Aristocats' case, it had, like, its own theme, and it feels... I don't, maybe it's just a nostalgic thing, but I don't know. I think I prefer that to, like, some pop song, some forgettable pop song by the latest whoever happens to be big. Whichever young musician's really taking off. I don't know. Maybe that's just the old person in me now, but I just immediately when I start the Disney movies of this era, just immediately those opening credits take you back somewhere. So somewhere significantly simpler and happier and all that other stuff. So, I guess I want to talk about first how these two in particular are also very animal-centric. Like, usually there's, in a lot of Disney movies, even animated ones, there can be a lot of focus on human characters and then animals coming in and out. Or there'll be cases of animals as the primary focus, but they kind of coexist with humans. Here, it's like they do coexist with humans, but really just at the start, and then as the movies progress, they become, like, almost completely animal-centric. So, what I like about that, though, is how we set up with the humans, like with 101 Dalmatians, when we get this whole opening scene, where this opening scene by itself could really be a short film. Like, everything from the opening scene to the opening shot to when they get married could pretty much be, when it fades out, that could basically be the end of a short film. And as far as, like, his and Roger's relationship and how he refers to Roger as his pet, that's kind of a continuous thing throughout the movie, is the animals call the humans pets, which is quite funny. And it's kind of subtly put in there to it, like, they don't really draw attention to it, they just kind of say it in, like, a couple of lines of dialogue here and there. But this whole sequence of Pongo playing matchmaker and looking at the different dogs and how the dogs sort of match the owners and vice versa as they're going by, I just really love this opening, and then the way he finally spots Perdita and they go to the park, and the way the love happens simultaneously between the humans and the dogs. I love the shot where it's implied that the dogs are getting married outside the church while Roger and Anita are actually getting married inside. And like I said, to establish that as far as the humans go, and as far as, like, the pet-owner relationship goes, that's just a really beautiful and simple and efficient way to do it. And pretty much the same thing with the Aristocats, where we actually get this sort of reverse angle when O'Malley comes into the story. We're going to kind of jump ahead here, because, well, it doesn't seem like maybe too much is established with the Madam and their relationship. We do get the sense that she couldn't live without them, and they probably couldn't live without her. And so the idea of them being separated like this, where it's like the Wonder Woman Dalmatians is more of they do get separated from the humans, but it actually becomes more of a story about the puppies being separated from the parents. Whereas this one, the main thing is that they're separated from the owner. And the fact that this is a singular owner probably plays a big part in that also, where it's like there's a much more likelihood that this human character will be in shambles because these cats are basically all she has at this point, besides her riches. But that's when we'll get into like the Edgar stuff. But yeah, when you talk about the chemistry between the two main animals here, I guess you could say, with O'Malley and Duchess, and then with Pongo and Perdita, we kind of talked about how they have this connection as parents and kind of have that shared responsibility, and that becomes what their thing is. But there's also when it shifts predominantly to the animals, and we get more introduced when the Twilight Bark happens at this moment. And I love the way this is done. It does feel like the Twilight Bark goes on forever, but it also feels like there's like a purpose for that. And it's the way we see like the different breed, like how the personalities of the animals we see, whether it be in passing or ones that end up becoming major characters, how their breeds kind of match their personalities is really well done. And I also love how we go farther and farther away from the city, and like the settings get more tranquil as they go. There's something like the Aristocats is, fine when they kind of go from place to place, but there's really something about 101 Dalmatians locations that really sticks out to me, where they really feel like almost like these, comforting paintings or something every time they change. And so whenever we go through this whole, I can't remember if they say exactly how many miles away from the city where by the time the Twilight Bark actually reaches its end. But I love the way it displays just the beauty of the animation in itself. And it's something that doesn't even have to be, it's not even showy about it. Like, it just essentially just feels like backgrounds. But they give such a beauty to this movie that I feel like is something I don't typically pay attention to in other animated movies, is their backgrounds the way I do when I'm watching this one. But anyway, despite getting sidetracked by that, the idea of introducing these other characters like the Colonel and Tibbs and stuff like that, and these side characters that end up really playing a part also. But like I said, it's like the way animals start to predominantly take over, even though we also have, Cruella and Jasper and Horace and stuff like that. I love how it does feel like animals kind of take over the movie for a while. And similarly with the Aristocats, where they do become a lot of the focus, and the love story especially kind of becomes the focus. But what I love about this especially is it might seem like, it's, this cat from the other side of the tracks meets the one that comes from the rich house, and it's like, yeah, that's whatever. But what I love about that is the fact that it's kind of immediate, because you would think with that setup that Duchess would be immediately put off by him, and that would be the conflict for a while, and how he maybe be somebody that she wouldn't want, her kids around and stuff like that. But the fact that everybody's just like immediately interested in his life, and they're not put off by him, and they kind of take to him pretty immediately, and actually becomes this story that is just as, effective here telling it with animals as it would be with humans, where these kittens just want a father figure, and this might be that guy, and it's like that age-old story that they actually do really well. I also love the way they show O'Malley's sort of, where he's not sure he wants to get into this kind of thing, but they don't do it in this sort of obvious way, where it's like this obvious or predictable way, where they kind of just throw in little hints about where he comes from and why he would be put off by this, he does talk pretty blatantly about he's been through so many owners, and owners have just been so quick to, essentially throw him away, which is why he's a stray at this point. That he doesn't really trust humans, and it's kind of unfathomable to him when they say that, their owner would be like, she'll be looking for them, and her life might be nothing without them and stuff like that. And like, she never felt alone with them, I think is what she says. And what I love about O'Malley's story here also is not only does that make sense that he would find it like he wouldn't believe that a human would actually treat a pet that way because he's just never experienced it. But when he's this is, and I'm not even sure if this is canon or not, but as soon as I heard it, I just kind of accepted it as this makes too much sense for it to not be the case. Um, when he first comes in, his very introduction, he's singing that song about himself, and he's saying all the names. And what's wild about this is I don't know how obvious it's supposed to be because it was really late in life when I learned what he was singing. Where he's saying the names Abraham DeLacy, Giuseppe Casey, and then he says Thomas O'Malley. Um, I was under the impression for the longest time, like maybe those were like jazz musicians, and he was saying he was on like that level of cool, like, oh, there's this person, then there's this person, then there's me. Or maybe like, you know, historical figures that were like traveling or something, since he kind of just goes from place to place and that's his life. But apparently that's not the case. Apparently that's his full name, which it was a very, very long time before I knew that. And the theory that I heard regarding that was that it was the reason his name is so long like that is because he's been collecting names from previous owners, like whether it be people who took him in or people maybe like homeless people or children on the street or something like held on to him and named him, and he's just been collecting names as he goes. And like I said, that makes too much sense to me. That I've just been rolling with it ever since because it just makes so much sense, and it makes sense to where he comes from, and especially that he would care enough about the people who gave them those names that he would hang on to them and remember them, which would show all the more pain of the fact that he was either rejected or maybe an owner died or something, and he's just been bouncing around from people since during his whole existence, basically. And so that there's so much here that makes him a sympathetic character because of that also. And the fact that because we feel that sympathy for him, we can immediately see why Duchess would be drawn to him also. And like I said, and the fact that I have to say again, that you would think because she comes from like the rich background that and like the luxurious background that she'd be immediately put off by him. And I love that that's just never really a thing in the movie. Like when she first meets him, like maybe there's a little bit of apprehensiveness there, but it's if it's there at all, it's very, very brief, and they all just kind of become like this family unit, whether they know it yet or not. How that happens pretty quickly. So I really love the way that was handled and how all of that never felt forced. And that makes the scenes later where they're talking about him being this potential father figure or something all the more powerful. Or the way he says like her eyes are like sapphires and stuff like that. It's like because the connection was so immediate and because they didn't like jerk around with it, that makes it all the more effective and efficient as far as that whole storyline goes. And I think it also shows how effective it is that by the time, because Edgar keeps coming in and out of the story as the villain, but by the time they're like on the roof and they've gone to meet like Scat Cat and the gang and stuff like that, and all those scenes have played out, and we get so invested in will he stay and be their dad? Will they figure out if they're gonna stay on the streets or he's gonna come home with him or whatever they're gonna do? By the time they get home, you almost think the movie is ending because it's like at least for me, sometimes I forget about Edgar because you get so wrapped up in everything else. And it's like when they get back and Edgar's there, it's like, oh, we're still doing this thing. Yeah, Edgar still wants to kill them. Okay, and then the climax can take place. So I love the way both of these are handled, where we have the sort of lived-in relationship already with Ponga and Perdita that has to evolve through them sticking together through the events of the movie, and here where it's like are they going to be a thing or aren't they a thing, but done in a really nice way, in a really sort of natural way for an animated movie about cats in this scenario. So I love all that stuff. And as far as like the kids go, I guess you'd call them, the puppies and the kittens, as far as the puppies here, I do love that it's basically the joke of them that they behave like human children, essentially. Where they stay up and they watch TV, and then there's the one kid that you can't drag away from the TV with Lucky. Rolly's always hungry, and it's like all on the way they're always sort of bickering at each other. and you almost forget you're watching puppies because they act like children, and it's and that while that's also quite funny, it also works as far as feeling the stakes when they're in trouble later, and the fact that the whole plot revolves around the fact that an insane woman wants to buy them and murder them and skin them. So that's going to be effective as it goes also. And I love how we get memorable moments here, like the Canine Crunchies commercial always sticks out. I love the weird little details this movie throws in also, like the moment when they finally get Lucky away from the TV and they're all going to bed, and there's that great moment also that's very actual kid-like, where it's like once the kids are in bed, then the adult dogs take their walks, and it's like the kids always long for like staying up past their bedtime to go on the walks and do what adults do and stuff like that. But no, this weird detail that sticks out is when after it's in the middle of the Canine Crunchies commercial, and Pongo shuts the TV off, and just as the TV's shutting off, the Canine Crunchies guy looks like shocked, like he's aware the TV's being turned off. I love how just random and weird that is, and funny that is. And yeah, more or less the same thing with the kittens and the Aristocats, where they may not act as much like normal children as the puppies in 101 Dalmatians do, but they act like spoiled rich kids quite well. And I love how also you can see like their individual personalities despite their childlike stuff. But it's in their like aristocratic lessons that they're taking, where it's like whatever they're taking lessons in kind of fits their personality also. That's kind of like what we see in 101 Dalmatians, where I was talking about the breeds seeming to match the personalities just by what they look like. And so I love all that stuff. Now, as far and it's nice that none of these characters are like annoying. Like I mean they're annoying to like the characters within the movie, but they're not really annoying to the audience. And that's a really fine line to play on. So I love that they were able to accomplish that. Now, one of the things I obviously really want to talk about are the villains that we have here. And while Edgar's fun, I do think we have to talk about one of the most notorious villains in Disney's villain lineup. And of course, Disney's villain lineup is pretty massive and sets a very high bar. But it's kind of hard. Cruella de Vil has to be in the top. For me, at least, I would say in the top 3. As far as, not just, Disney villains as far as being, like, fun characters, but how evil they are. Because obviously, we're in the 60s with 101 Dalmatians, and we're in the early 70s with the Aristocats. I think it's like 1970, actually, the Aristocats is, and both of them do have similar plans. But as far as Cruella's plan, well, we already talked about, she wants to kill them and skin them and wear them, but, and sell the aftermath, but, I love the fact that it took, another thing that it just took me forever to realize was the way Perdita calls her that devil woman. And it's like, because that just makes so much sense in itself, like the name is just fitting as it is, it actually took me forever to realize that she calls her that because of the way DeVille is spelled. So, I don't know. I actually don't know that I realized how DeVille was actually spelled until Glenn Close's license plate in the live-action remake. That was in, 96 or 97? I think it's 96. So details like that, where I caught up with them, like, later. But like I said, the fact that she fits that description anyway without you realizing it's a play on her name says a lot about the character. And the fact that her own description of herself says a lot about her. When she first comes into the house and she asks, how she's been, Anita asks how she is. She's self-described, miserable, perfectly wretched. And that's it, just immediately. Actually, even before that moment, I remember, no matter how many times I watched this as a kid, maybe even still a little bit now, as like sometimes the way our childhood fears kind of carry over inherently, as we grow older, but, the silhouette, just Cruella's silhouette against the door before we've even met her yet, and she's just ringing the doorbell over and over again. I always found that really intimidating as a child. Like I said, maybe some of it's kind of inherently carried over to adulthood, but Yeah, and just in general, the fact that Perdita already knows who she is, and that we can kind of get a sense of her in this first scene, not just watching her in action and her full evilly flamboyant mode, but just the way Perdita's reacting to her, where she hides from her, and she talks about there's that kind of quietly heartbreaking moment when Perdita doesn't know yet what she wants with the puppies, and the way she says it is, what does she want with them? She can't possibly love them. Like, to just immediately rule that the fact that that was Perdita's first thought was, well, the first reason people would want puppies is to love them, and the fact that she already knows that that is not what's happening here is like that's kind of shattering actually, and it's so quietly done, and that and to bring Jasper and Horace into this also, where you have this character that's like so over the top evil in this glorious way, and then you have these two bumbling idiots, which tends to be, you know, kind of the trope, but it does feel like that trope kind of comes back to Jasper and Horace, at least as far as like, children's movies or animated movies or whatever go, and there's little details about them also that I just love that show like their idiocy in this funny way, while this sort of, somewhat harrowing thing is happening where they break into the house and they steal the puppies, knowing what we know is intended to happen to them. To see these characters that are actually quite funny can be quite jarring. They can also be kind of threatening in their own way. Like the way, Jasper creeps up the steps, I remember kind of freaking me out a little bit when I was like, obviously, when we're talking about me at my prime of watching this movie over and over again, we're talking like, 4 and 5 years old. So when you're 4 and 5 years old, Jasper can even be intimidating. Horace, never so much. Horace is almost too bumbling, but it kind of matches up with Jasper being still bumbling, but more on the threatening side. There's a nice balance between the two of them. I love how when they first get there, they've disguised their bag to make it look like they're from the electric company. But there's two things about this joke. There's the fact that Horace has misspelled electric company, and he's forgotten a letter, so he does the thing where you insert the letter in with like an arrow, but he's inserted the arrow in the wrong place. So it's so there's like a double joke with that electric company bag, which is quite funny to me. And there's also a moment where it's when they're on the phone and they're talking to Cruella, and there's the newspaper article, and so they put the phone up to the newspaper to let Cruella know what's happened. That's very funny to me also. And I also love the fact that, think about this when you think about how bumbling they are. There's this whole scene where they watch What's My Crime? Which is another nice, clever joke in itself, where there was that old TV show, What's My Line, where you had to guess, like, the person's line of work, and it's set up exactly the way you see What's My Crime set up. There's bits of it on YouTube you can see where, like a guy that saw, like, the Kennedy assassination or something, or, like, Colonel Sanders was on it, and it's it's prisoners, and some of the prisoners they actually know from prison. And this becomes a whole... They devote, like, a whole scene to this joke, which is great. But think about the fact that it's also this great escape scene for the puppies, but what's being shown about Jasper and Horace here is that they're too lazy to do their job, and that's what's driving Cruella crazy. But when you think about the fact that, Jasper and Horace are harmless, it's Cruella that's crazy. Jasper and Horace know what their job is. Just right now, when What's My Crime is on, they're too lazy to kill and skin the puppies. It's not that they don't want to. They're too lazy to kill and skin the puppies. And so that's subtly sadistic in its own right. So yeah, as far as the villains go, you can't get more top tier than Cruella de Vil, and we'll talk more about her also when we're talking about the climax, but I do want to come over here to Edgar real quick. So yeah, Edgar isn't near as scary. In fact, Edgar is quite a funny character, even though he also has a plan to kill the kittens. That's the whole thing. So it's insane. Disney was wild at this time. where it's like you can have funny villains that had plans like this, where they do treat it. It actually feels like it's with purpose that they treat Edgar like a joke, because even though his plan is to kill kittens, we have this moment where he's driving down the road on his little motorcycle, and every time the engine backfires, his hat flies off and back onto his head. And that's when he falls down the stairs, and that's funny. And it's like that almost distracts us from what it is he wants to do. But to go back and talk about where Edgar's plan began, um, as far as his employment as the butler, and his relationship with not just the madam, but her lawyer who comes in, and it's like this lawyer comes bumbling in. He's like practically blind. He's like tripping up the steps, and Edgar has to follow him, and then they're dancing around and all that, and it's like Edgar seems very evil because he wants to kill the kittens to inherit the money. But it's like, when you look at these characters, it's fun to watch the madam dance with the lawyer and stuff, especially when we know how lonely the madam is by what Duchess tells us later, and how much she really depends on the kittens for companionship. But at the same time, when we see this lawyer bumbling around and dancing around, and you think about how many times over Edgar's probably seen all of this play out exactly like this, and how he's probably been slowly driven insane. There's something in there where it's like, okay, I like the fact that they've put us enough in Edgar's shoes to where it's like, I get it if he snaps. I still see him as the villain. I still see him as a bad guy for wanting to kill the kittens. Hopefully he gets a hilarious comeuppance later. But, you get it a little bit. You get his frustration a little bit. I love especially when they play up that, when he learns that the inheritance has been left to the kittens, and it's like, for as long as they're alive, once all the kittens are gone, then Edgar gets the money. I love the fact that he counts the 9 lives for each of them, and that's what makes him go, oh, I've got to kill them. That's the only way I'm going to get the money, is if I kill them. So to set to set up this sadistic plan in such a funny way is like pure this era Disney. Um, and I love it, and I kind of miss when Disney was this sick and twisted, honestly. But yeah, like, about him being treated like a joke, though, there's also the moment where it becomes like Roquefort figures out what's going on, and the reason Roquefort figures out what's going on is because he lets it slip. He lets it slip to Frou-Frou, the horse. And so when you think about it, it's like, wow, what a ridiculous thing to do. And it's like, oh, it's funny because he's such a dumb character. But there's a line here that says so much about Edgar, and it may because that's another reason why I go so easy on him when it comes to like hating his life, around the madam and the lawyer and stuff like that. Is he confesses his plan to Frou-Frou, and then he says, "Aren't you proud of me?" He says, "Aren't you proud of me?" to the horse. And it's like, Edgar has not had a fulfilling life. Like, Edgar is not a happy person at all. The only person he can confide in and hopes that feels proud of him is the horse. And so it's like, it almost makes it, that one line almost makes me sympathetic to Edgar. But once again, he's much closer to Jasper and Horace than he is Cruella. And I think that also is what makes him such a funny villain. Because Cruella has funny moments also, but we're almost laughing in an exasperated way at her insanity, which is, and just how great Betty Lou Gerson's performance is, and the way she's animated and all that, and the way she smokes also is basically like its own character. Like, the smoke is its own character practically. And I also love, and that's another thing when you talk about like what you would see in Disney movies here that you wouldn't now, and it's like it's so kind of jarring to go back to these and see characters like casually smoking and drinking, and it's like there's like drunk jokes all over Disney in this era, especially in the Aristocats. There's a couple, like Uncle Waldo. Uncle Waldo's an entire character where his entire character trait is that he's drunk. There's the funny moment towards the end when Roquefort is taking Scat-Cat and the gang to the house to sort out Edgar, and this guy, sees this go by where a whole crew of cats goes by, and then a mouse after them, and the first thing he does is like check his alcohol to see like how much has he been drinking, which is a really great joke. And like I said, a joke you probably wouldn't see in a Disney movie now. So that's really fun. Um, now, now that we talked about the villains, to talk about the latter parts of these movies, where the stakes sort of increase and suspense might set in. Um, I've got a whole thing to go into about 101 Dalmatians doing this. So to talk about the later parts of the Aristocats, we do have like the train scene, and then we have like the river rescue and stuff like that, which are these nice moments of action or whatever. As far as like suspense goes, I like that they use suspense in a comedic sense. By there being a whole scene. This was always my favorite scene as a kid. And I honestly think it's still my favorite scene of the movie, even though the more heartfelt scenes kind of I get them more now, and they're more effective to me now. But I don't know. This scene where Edgar has to get his hat and umbrella back from Napoleon and Lafayette is this whole sort of ingenious slapstick, and it's like the way they've sort of inserted suspense into the slapstick to where it's like I was talking about, where we don't side with Edgar, but there's something about this scene where the suspense of it, the funny suspense of it, comes from the fact of the way he sneaks around and he's trying so, precisely to get the hat and umbrella back. The suspense of the scene comes from the fact that do we want him to get them back without Napoleon and Lafayette noticing him? Because that's like where the effectiveness of the scene comes in. And I love that stuff. And that, like I said, I think that's my favorite scene of the movie. And then there's also when we do get to the house, when it's like, oh yeah, Edgar's still a problem. And he's gonna put them in the trunk and send them to Timbuktu. This is another thing that kind of occurred to me as time went on and I got older. Was there was quite a while when I was a kid, because of this movie, I just assumed that Timbuktu was like a term for really, really far away. Because I feel like I've heard it in that context apart from this movie. And yeah, then later in life I learned that Timbuktu was an actual place, and it kind of blew my mind. So yeah, and then the climax is fun and slapstick and stuff like that, and it goes with the nature of the rest of Edgar's scenes, and it's fun. And he gets to come up, he gets put in the trunk, and then it's like, God knows if he's gonna make it to Timbuktu, but yeah, it's a fun climax. One of the things I've always really loved about 101 Dalmatians, something that I could surprisingly gather watching it as like a 4 and 5 year old, but watching it now also, where I talked about the Napoleon and Lafayette scene in the Aristocats is like suspenseful, but in a funny way. 101 Dalmatians' whole like last act is just pure suspense, with not a lot of comedy backing it up at all. It's just like kind of genuinely suspenseful. And the fact that these scenes are played to, like I said, these beautiful locations like Dinsford. Like when we get to Dinsford, that's where things like are really starting to amp up, and the stakes are like really getting high. And this is such a this is a place I like. You talk about wanting to go inside a movie and live in a location. Like, how perfect and peaceful does Dinsford look despite the climax of this movie? And the way that the sky is always like that winter pink is just it's a beautiful setting. Even before this, actually, when they're trudging through the snow, and that collie comes in and saves them. That collie coming out of the snow always felt like this almost like a dreamlike image to me. And then when he takes them in, and then from there on, Corella's basically caught up to them, and then everything starts to amp up a little bit, and there's multiple moments that are like genuinely suspenseful. And this is after the escape, where I talk about the "What's My Crime" scene. Like, that's a suspenseful scene in itself. But when Jasper, Horace, and Corella have finally caught up to them, and we get this first moment when they're under the bridge and like the water underneath is icy, so Rolly slides out, and we're watching the flashlight beam from Jasper, and it's like that's what's like. If Rolly gets caught by this, then everything's done. Then there's the scene where they cross the street and Pongo gets the idea to cover up their tracks, but it's when he's like right in the middle of the road and he's covering up the tracks at the very last minute, and you can hear Cruella's car coming. Like, you can hear that horn from a mile away. But you know she's like right there, like right at the top of the hill, and is just about to come over. That's always been like this really nail biting moment to me. There's the scene where they cover themselves in soot, and then they walk directly in front of her car, and then there's the whole dripping that eventually reveals them. But the one that's always gotten me the most, the one where I actually maybe subconsciously made a game out of it, when I was a kid, like when me and my brother were outside, maybe some other friends also, but this scene where they're inside the building and Cruella is slowly driving down the road and she drives right by the window and looks in and they have to keep ducking down. And then that's that moment and the way you can hear like just her car like idling. But then there's that second moment where Cruella comes back and Perdita ducks down like Corella's car is already in view in the window by the time Perdita sees it and ducks down. And it's like how close that was. And I think this, I don't know, traumatized me so much. We actually like made this game where whenever we'd just be outside doing whatever, but then if a car came down the street, like turned the corner and started coming down our street, we would like hide. And I feel like I started that game, and I feel like subconsciously it was like because of that rush I would get and still get watching that scene where Cruella drives by the window. Like that's I feel like that's where that comes from, where that came from. So that's like I said, the way this movie uses suspense and takes it seriously is something that still really sticks out to me about the last act of this movie. And and then of course that goes into this whole big chase sequence where we see Cruella at her peak insane, like just when we think she can't get, you know, she's reached her peak craziness. The the car breaks apart. She's got the insane look on her face, and it's this really magnificent threat. Whereas, like I said, she's hilariously insane, but also gloriously insane, and I love it. And then after all of this carnage, we do finally get both our endings here, where extended families are gained by everybody, where everybody's living in harmony in the Aristocats. All the puppies come in, and everybody's living in harmony in 101 Dalmatians. I feel like it's especially satisfying in 101 Dalmatians because the reason that they're rich and they can afford a place to have these 99 other pets is because of Cruella, because the song took off. And so the fact that not only is Cruella just destroyed now, but she indirectly caused them to be rich and to give all these puppies like a happy home, as opposed to what she had in store for them. So that's I think that brings us to a close on both of these movies. So that's how I feel about them. Like I said, I really like the Aristocats. I think I like the Aristocats more now than I did when I was a kid. But 101 Dalmatians is still like one of my favorite animated movies, certainly one of my favorite Disney movies. And like I said, even coming back to it now, still, like, you know, at least annually, it kind of, not only does it take me back to that place, which I know a lot of people would say is the reason that I still think so highly of it, but no, it's just really, it's like I said, as far as the beautiful animation, as far as like the locations and like the use of suspense and all that, and how seriously it takes the stakes of it, it still really sticks out to me. So I will still always love this movie, I think, and it'll still be a top tier Disney movie to me, even though I don't think it's one of the first things people will think of when they think of like Disney classics, but it should be, at least to me. So this is where I can leave this. Next, I think we're going to do reviews for new movies like Bella's Afraid and No Hard Feelings and stuff like that. Stuff that I'm sure people watching a Disney video will be so into. So all those audiences definitely cross over. Yeah. So yeah. So until that, I think that's it.